The morning Jonas Ramsey rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, the dust was so thick on the main street that a man could taste the whole territory on his tongue, and he had no idea that the woman standing outside the general store with a wilted sprig of dried lavender pressed to her nose would be the reason he would spend the rest of his life learning things he never thought he would need to know. He had not come to Caldwell looking for anything except work. His horse, a steady roan gelding named Copper, needed new shoes and a rest, and Jonas himself needed coin badly enough that he would have shoveled out every stable from here to Dodge City without complaint. He was 28 years old, lean from hard riding, and carrying a reputation as a fair hand with cattle and a reliable one with a fence line. He had worked 3 different spreads across Texas and Oklahoma before a drought had dried up the last outfit that employed him, and now he was heading north with the vague notion that the ranches around Caldwell might be hiring. He tied Copper at the post outside the farrier's shop and was walking toward the door when he caught sight of her. She was standing just outside Patterson's general store, a crate of dry goods balanced against her hip, and she was holding that sprig of dried lavender with such gentle attention that Jonas stopped walking altogether. She was not doing anything remarkable. She was simply standing in the morning sun, eyes closed for just a moment, breathing in what very little scent the dried thing still carried. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a plain bonnet, and her dress was a faded blue that had once been a deeper color, and there was something about the way she held herself, straight-backed and quiet, that made the street noise seem to soften around her. Then the crate slipped. Jonas moved without thinking. He crossed the few yards between them in 3 long strides and caught the crate before it hit the ground, steadying it with both hands, and found himself standing close enough to the woman that he could see the faint freckles across the bridge of her nose and the startled brown eyes that were now looking directly at him. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady, not flustered, though her cheeks had gone a shade pinker. "I had a better grip on it than that a moment ago." "The lavender was distracting you," Jonas said, and then immediately felt like a fool for saying it. But she looked at him with something that was not quite a smile and not quite amusement but landed somewhere between the two. "I suppose it was," she said. "It is about all the flour I have left." He held the crate until she had shifted her grip, and then he took a step back and touched the brim of his hat. "Jonas Ramsey," he said. "Eudora Yates," she replied, and then she walked back inside the store as though that were the entirety of the exchange. He stood on the board sidewalk for a moment, watching the door swing shut behind her, and then he shook his head and went to see about getting Copper shod. He did not expect to see her again that afternoon, but Caldwell was a small enough town in those years that such expectations were often wrong. The farrier, a thick-armed man named Holt, told Jonas that the Double Cross Ranch to the east of town was looking for hands, and that he ought to speak to the foreman before another day passed. Jonas thanked him, and, having time to spare while Copper was being seen to, wandered to the saloon not for whiskey particularly, but for information, which was just as often served there. The saloon keeper, a practical-minded man named Greer, confirmed the Double Cross was hiring and also told Jonas, without being asked, that the widow Yates had been running her father's homestead east of town since her husband passed 2 winters ago, and that she was a remarkably capable woman who came into town once a week for supplies and spoke to almost nobody more than was strictly necessary. "Widow," Jonas said, and he had not meant to say anything at all. Greer gave him a knowing look and wiped down the bar. The late Mr. Yates was a decent enough fellow, but not a strong constitution. Fever took him in January of '80. She has been managing that homestead alone ever since, her and one hired man named Cletus, who is pushing 60 and half lame besides. Jonas drank the rest of his water, paid for it honestly, and told himself that knowing this information had no bearing whatsoever on his plans, which were strictly to secure employment and save enough money to eventually buy a small piece of land somewhere sensible. He found the foreman of the Double Cross Ranch that same afternoon. His name was Del Whitmore, a wide-shouldered man with a gray-streaked mustache and the kind of direct gaze that took a man's measure in about 4 seconds. Jonas had enough references, 2 of them written, and one of them the name of a cattleman in Abilene that Whitmore apparently knew personally. And by the time the sun had slid to the middle of the afternoon sky, Jonas had a position and the use of a bunk in the ranch's modest bunkhouse. The double-cross land ran along the eastern edge of the territory nearby, which meant that his morning rides to check the fence lines on the northern stretch took him past a certain homestead every few days. He told himself this was coincidence, which it was the first time. It was slightly less coincidence the second time, and the third time he had genuinely rerouted his path in a way that added 20 minutes to his circuit, which he admitted to himself was not coincidence at all. The Yates homestead was a modest piece of land, maybe 160 acres, with a solid little house and a barn that had seen better years. The fields were planted with winter wheat that looked about as good as one could expect from a woman working mostly alone. There was a vegetable patch behind the house that was well tended, and Jonas could see the old hired man, Cletus, mending a fence near the livestock pen at a pace that suggested the fence would be mended sometime around Thanksgiving. He did not stop the first 2 times he rode past. But the third time he saw Eudora Yates in the field, working with a hoe between the rows of young wheat, and she looked up and shaded her eyes with one hand, recognized him, and he felt the necessity of at least raising a hand in acknowledgement. She raised hers in return. 2 days after that, a section of his fence line that bordered her property came down in a spring wind, and Jonas rode out to repair it with the full and honest knowledge that it was also the polite thing to stop and let the neighboring property owner know what had happened and that it was being fixed. This was a perfectly reasonable reason to knock at her door. She answered it herself. She was wearing a work apron over her dress, and there was flour on her left wrist, and she regarded him with those steady brown eyes in a way that made him feel simultaneously at ease and entirely off balance. "Mrs. Yates," he said, hat in hand. "My name is Jonas Ramsey. I am working the double cross. Their north fence blew down last night and it borders your property. I wanted you to know it is being repaired today and that no cattle got through." "I know who you are," she said. "You work for the double cross and you ride past my field every few days and you have yet to find a reason to stop until now." He felt heat rise to the back of his neck. "I did not want to impose." Something softened in her expression just slightly. "You are not imposing," she said. "Would you like some coffee?" "It is the least I can do if your ranch's fence is going to be a burden to repair this morning." "It is not a burden," he said, and then, "Yes, ma'am. Coffee would be appreciated." She had a clean kitchen with a wood stove that radiated warmth and a table with 4 chairs, only 2 of which looked regularly used. She poured the coffee black and set a plate of biscuits between them without ceremony, and she sat across from him with her own cup and looked at him as though she were simply curious rather than cautious. They talked for the better part of an hour, and Jonas later could not have recounted every topic covered, except that he knew they had covered the spring planting season, the price of grain in Caldwell, the general quality of Del Whitmore as a man to work for, and at some point, inevitably, the subject of how she had come to be managing the homestead alone. "My husband Daniel was a good man," she said, and her voice was matter-of-fact but not cold. "He had always been somewhat delicate and the winter of 1880 was particularly harsh. He passed in January. My father had already gone west by then and left me the land. It made more sense to stay than to go anywhere else." "Do you have family nearby?" Jonas asked. "My sister is in Missouri," she said. "She writes. My father is in California and writes rarely. But Caldwell has been good to me. People here are decent mostly." He noted that she did not sound lonely exactly. She sounded like a woman who had made a careful accounting of her situation and arrived at something like acceptance without arriving at resignation. He respected that enormously. He finished his coffee, thanked her, replaced his hat, and walked back out to his horse with the feeling that something had shifted in his interior landscape, some small but consequential geological movement, like a creek changing its course by 6 inches that would eventually redirect where it met the river. Over the following weeks, the stops at the Yates homestead became a regular and mutually acknowledged thing. He would come by on his afternoon off, usually Sunday, and bring something useful if he had it: a packet of nails from the hardware store in town, a spare saw blade he had come by honestly. She would have coffee ready, not because she expected him exactly, but because she made a full pot on Sunday mornings and there was always enough left. They talked easily. This surprised him, because Jonas was not by nature a man who talked much. Around the other ranch hands, he said what was necessary and no more, and around Del Whitmore he was precise and brief. But around Eudora Yates, he found himself saying things he had not planned to say, and listening to things she said with an attention that was entirely involuntary. She had grown up in Missouri. Her father had been a farmer who had a particular love for growing things, not just crops but flowers as well, which was, she told him one Sunday afternoon in early May, not something that made a great deal of practical sense on a working farm but had made her childhood feel like something more than just labor. He grew roses along the fence line, she said, looking at her hands around her coffee cup, and hollyhocks beside the house. And in the spring there were always wildflowers in the meadow near the creek. I could cut them and put them in a jar on the kitchen table and the house felt entirely different. Different how? Jonas asked, genuinely curious. She thought about it. Like it remembered what beautiful was, she said. Like it was not just a place where work happened but a place where living happened too. He looked at the table between them, which was bare of anything but the coffee cups and the plate of biscuits, and he thought about that. "You miss that," he said. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had something slightly sad behind it, the way a person smiles at a memory that cannot be brought forward into the present. "I miss having fresh flowers," she said simply. "It seems a small and foolish thing to miss when there is so much else to think about." "It does not seem foolish to me," Jonas said. She looked at him with that direct look she had. "What do you miss?" she asked. "From before, I mean. From wherever you came from." Nobody had asked him that in a long time. He considered it honestly. "I grew up in Tennessee," he said, "on a farm there. My mother had a kind of order to everything. Every item in the house had a place, and everything was kept in that place, and there was a feeling of rightness to it. I miss that, the sense of things being in their place." She nodded as though she understood exactly what he meant. He thought she probably did. He rode back to the Double Cross that evening with something turning quietly in the back of his mind, some thought that had not yet declared itself fully but was working its way toward the surface with slow and steady persistence. He did not know anything about gardening. He had grown up on a farm, yes, but his role had been in the fields with the crops, not in whatever domestic territory his mother had cultivated near the house. He had never planted flowers. He had never had occasion to, and frankly it had never occurred to him that occasion might arise. He was a cowhand, a fence mender, a cattle driver when it was called for. He could read weather in cloud formations and track a lame steer across rocky ground and fix a pump when the piston ring failed. But he went into Caldwell 2 days later with a specific purpose, and he stopped at Patterson's general store, and he asked old Mrs. Patterson, who was a small and formidably knowledgeable woman with white hair and reading spectacles on a chain, whether she had any flower seeds. Mrs. Patterson regarded him over her spectacles with an expression of such thorough comprehension that Jonas felt briefly transparent. "What kind?" she asked. "All of them," he said. She sold him hollyhock seeds because hollyhocks were hardy and would grow in the Kansas soil with minimal complaint. She sold him seeds for black-eyed Susans because they were native to the territory and practically unstoppable once established. She sold him larkspur and coneflower, and because she had a small supply, a precious paper packet of Sweet William. She also sold him a small, battered copy of a home gardening manual that had apparently been in the store for 3 years without finding a buyer, and she did not comment on any of it, for which Jonas was deeply grateful. He took everything back to the bunkhouse and read the gardening manual from cover to cover by lamplight over 2 nights, and the other hands did not give him too hard a time about it, mostly because Jonas had quietly demonstrated on 2 separate occasions that he could outwork any of them, and once that he could, when pushed, outfight any of them as well. He had the kind of calm reputation that made mockery feel like a risky proposition. He thought carefully about where a garden would make sense on the Yates property. He had walked around enough of it now to have a good mental picture. The best spot, he decided, was along the south-facing side of the house, where the sun was generous and there was some natural shelter from the north wind provided by the house itself. The soil there was not being used for anything currently. The ground would need turning. The problem was that he had no standing to simply show up on a woman's property and start digging. And there was another problem, which was that she had not asked him to. She had mentioned, without any expectation attached to the words, that she missed fresh flowers. She had not looked at him with imploring eyes. She had not made the statement as a request. It had simply been one honest thing shared with another, the way people share things when they are beginning to trust each other. He turned this over in his mind for several days, during which he rode his fence lines and worked cattle and ate his meals in the bunkhouse and kept his own counsel, while the packets of seeds sat on the shelf above his bunk with the patience of things that had no urgency of their own. On his following Sunday visit, he sat at her kitchen table and drank his coffee, and they talked about the wheat, which was coming in well, and about a dispute in Caldwell between 2 businessmen over a property line that was entertaining the town with its pettiness, and about whether the summer looked like it would be dry or wet based on the current pattern of weather. And then, near the end of the visit, when he was pulling on his gloves to leave, he said, without having entirely planned to say it in quite this way, "Mrs. Yates, I was wondering if you would let me do something for you." She looked at him with those level eyes. "What sort of something?" "I have been reading," he said, which felt like an honest way to start, "about growing flowers. The south side of your house is sitting empty and the sun there is good, and I thought if you were willing I might turn that ground and plant some things, hollyhocks and such, some other varieties. It would not interfere with your wheat or your garden." The silence that followed was not a long one, but it had weight to it. He watched something move through her expression, something he could not fully read, but that looked like surprise, and then something warmer that she almost immediately gathered back in. "You have been reading about growing flowers," she said. "I have a manual," he confirmed. "And seeds. I bought them from Mrs. Patterson." She looked at him for another moment, and something in her face did what it had not done before, at least not in his presence. It became briefly unguarded. "Jonas," she said, using his first name for the first time, and then stopped, as though she needed a moment to collect the rest of the sentence. "Why would you do that?" He was honest, because it seemed to him that being anything else would be a disservice to both of them. "Because you said you missed having fresh flowers, and it struck me as something I could do something about." She looked down at her coffee cup, and he could see from the slight movement at the corner of her mouth that she was working against a fuller smile than she usually allowed herself. When she looked back up, she said, "I would not say no to that." He started the following Saturday. He arrived early, before she came out to meet him, and he had borrowed a good spade from the Double Cross and brought it along with his seeds. He walked along the south side of the house and stood in the morning light assessing the ground, looking at how the sun fell, and how the angle of the house would shelter things in a wind, and he felt something he had not quite felt before in relation to a physical task, a kind of anticipatory pleasure that was both about the work itself and about something larger that the work represented. When Eudora came out with 2 cups of coffee, she found him already on one knee with his hand pressed flat into the soil, testing the composition of it the way the manual had told him to do. She handed him a cup without comment and crouched beside him, pressing her own fingers into the earth. "It is good soil," she said. "Sandy but not too much. My father would have approved." "That is what the book says to look for," Jonas said. He paused. "You should be involved in deciding where things go. They are your flowers." She looked at him with a soft intentness. "Our flowers," she said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded and stood up and turned to look at the stretch of ground along the house. "I think the hollyhocks should be at the back, nearest the house wall. They grow tall and they would look right against the boards there." "I was thinking the same thing," he said, which was true. They planned it together, her with a kind of gentle authority that came from memory, from her father's garden in Missouri, and him with the more theoretical knowledge of the manual, supplemented by the practical logic of a man who had spent his adult life reading landscape and knowing how things grew or failed to grow. They disagreed twice, mildly, and both times arrived at a compromise that was better than either of their original positions. He turned the soil that morning with the spade, working in steady rows, and she worked alongside him with a smaller hand tool, breaking up the clods after he turned them and working in a portion of the composted material from her vegetable garden. Cletus, the old hired man, came around the corner of the house at one point, looked at what they were doing with an expression of benign bewilderment, and then went back to whatever slow and patient work he had been engaged with. They planted the seeds together that afternoon. He let her handle the hollyhock seeds herself, since they were clearly the ones that mattered most to her, and he watched the care with which she placed each one, the distance she measured between them with the span of her hand, the way she pressed the soil over them with a tenderness that looked like the physical expression of hope. By late afternoon the planting was done and the ground was watered from the pump, and they sat on the front steps of the house with the last of the day's light turning gold around them, and Eudora said, "My father used to say that the best thing about planting is that you have to believe in the future to do it at all. You cannot plant a seed and not believe something will come." Jonas thought about that. "I have never planted a garden," he said. "Until today." She looked at him sideways. "How does it feel?" "Like I did something that actually matters," he said, and he had not known he was going to say that, but he knew immediately that it was true. She looked back at the turned earth along the side of the house, still dark and damp, full of its small, invisible cargo. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Jonas, I mean that." "I know you do," he said. They sat for a while longer in the easy silence that had by now become one of the things Jonas most valued in the world. And then he put his hat back on and told her he would come back to check on things in a few days. And he rode back to the double cross in the long spring dusk, with the feeling that the creek inside him had changed its course by considerably more than 6 inches. He came back that Wednesday and then again on Saturday, and then again the Sunday after that. And by the second week, there were small green sprouts appearing along the south wall of the house, fragile and bright and absolutely deliberate, standing in their careful rows like a declaration of intent. Eudora met him at the door that Sunday with an expression he had not seen on her face before. She was smiling, not the small careful smile she usually deployed, but something larger and more undefended that made her look both younger and more herself at once. "Come and see," she said, and she took him around the side of the house by the wrist. Her fingers warmed through his sleeve and showed him the sprouts. He looked at them for a long moment, these small green things he had put in the earth with his own hands, and felt a warmth in his chest that was not entirely unlike pride but was also something else, something that had more to do with her expression than with the plants themselves. "They are doing it," she said. "They are actually growing." "Of course they are," he said, and then smiled at her, and she laughed, a real laugh, round and unguarded, and it was the best sound he had heard in a long time. Through May and into June, the garden along the south wall of the Yates homestead became an ongoing and absorbing project. The hollyhocks came up strong, and the black-eyed Susans began to show their first true leaves, and the coneflowers established themselves with the vigorous practicality of native plants. The sweet William was slower, more temperamental, and Jonas consulted his manual about it with the focused seriousness he usually reserved for cattle management, which occasionally made Eudora smile at him in a way that was both warm and slightly teasing. He was at the homestead often enough by June that Cleta stopped looking bewildered by his presence and simply incorporated him into the general logic of the property, occasionally asking him to carry something heavy or help with a task that required two able-bodied people. Jonas obliged without making anything of it. He helped mend the barn roof one afternoon when rain was clearly coming and the shingles needed attention, and he did it because it needed doing and because he was there, and because he was beginning to understand that this place and the woman who ran it had become something central to his daily orientation in a way that no piece of land or specific location ever had before. He had not told her how he felt. He was not a man who spoke quickly about such things. He had been in the company of women before, in passing, in the way that a traveling man sometimes was, but there had never been anything that felt like this, like a gradual and total shift in what mattered most to him on any given morning. He thought about her when he was working the fence lines. He thought about what she had said the last time he had seen her, and what he had wanted to say in return, and what the correct way to proceed was for a man who was a cowhand with a modest salary and no land of his own, in relation to a woman who had already buried one husband and was managing her own affairs with considerable competence. He discussed this with nobody except Copper, who had no useful contributions to make, but who listened steadily, while Jonas walked him along the fence lines and thought out loud. The conversation he had not been looking for happened in late June on an evening when he had stopped at the homestead to drop off a small sack of bone meal that the manual had recommended for encouraging flowering, and Eudora had asked him to stay for supper, which was not unprecedented at this point, but always carried a small additional weight of intention. They ate at the kitchen table in the evening light, the windows open to the warm June air, and she had made a rabbit stew with biscuits, and they talked about ordinary things for most of the meal. Then near the end she set down her spoon and looked at him with the directness she always had, but with something additional in it, some resolve that she had clearly been building up to. "Jonas," she said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "What are you doing here?" she said. "And I do not mean tonight. I mean here on this property every few days, helping with the garden and the barn and anything else that needs attending to." She paused. "I am not asking it as a complaint. I am asking because I want to understand what you are thinking, and I have found it is better to ask directly than to spend time wondering." He looked at her for a moment and thought that she deserved directness in return. "I am here because this is where I want to be," he said. "Because the days when I come here are better days than the ones I do not, because I care about what happens to this place and the people on it." He paused and then finished, "Because I care about you, specifically." She held his gaze without flinching or deflecting. "I see," she said, and her voice was quiet but not withdrawn. "I do not have much to offer," he said. "I work for wages and I have some money saved and I have skills. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I only wanted to be honest since you asked." "How old are you?" she asked. 28, he said. She nodded, as though this were a relevant data point being filed away. "I am 26, she said. "I was 18 when I married Daniel. I thought I knew what I was doing, and in some ways I did, and in some ways I did not. I have not been in a hurry to repeat the experience." "I understand that," he said. "But," she said, and the word had the feeling of a door opening carefully, not thrown wide but moved just enough to let light through, "I have also not been unhappy about the fact that you come here, in case that needed to be said." He looked at her and felt something settle in him, some anxiety he had been carrying without fully acknowledging. "It needed to be said," he confirmed. She picked up her spoon again, which was the signal that they were returning to the ordinary surface of the conversation, but she was smiling in a small and private way that stayed with him all the way back to the double cross in the warm June dark. July in Kansas could be brutal, and the summer of 1882 was no exception. The heat came down like a physical weight, the kind that makes cattle restless and horses irritable and humans short-tempered. At the double cross, the work intensified with the season, longer days in the saddle, water management becoming critical, and Jonas worked hard and slept heavily and did not miss a Sunday. The garden on the south side of the Yates house had become, by the middle of July, something remarkable. The hollyhocks were well over 4 feet tall, their stems thick with blooms in shades of pink and white and a deep rosy red, standing against the weathered boards of the house like something from a painting. The black-eyed Susans had spread enthusiastically beyond their original boundaries into a wide, sunny drift of yellow and brown, and the coneflowers stood in their dignified purple clusters nearby. The sweet William had finally, magnificently, caught up to its neighbors, and it was filling the air around the south wall with a fragrance that Jonas could smell from 10 feet away as he came around the corner of the house. But it was Eudora's face that he would remember most from that morning. She was standing in front of the hollyhocks with a pair of small scissors, cutting the longest stems with the careful consideration of someone selecting something precious. She had already cut a bouquet of mixed flowers, hollyhocks and black-eyed Susans, and a handful of the deep purple coneflowers, and she was holding them against her apron in a loose bundle, and her expression was the kind that people sometimes have when they are deeply, privately happy and do not yet know they are being observed. She looked up when she heard his boots on the ground, and her expression did not close down. She simply held up the flowers toward him, the whole abundant armful of color, and said, "Look at them, Jonas." He looked at them and then at her and said, "I know. Do you know what I did this morning?" she said. "I put some in a jar on the kitchen table. Just like my father used to. The house looks like a house again." He swallowed against something in his chest and said, "Come and show me." She brought him inside and showed him the jar of flowers on the kitchen table, hollyhocks standing tall in an old canning jar of water, a few of the yellow Susan faces leaning out over the rim, and she was right. The kitchen did look different. It looked like a place where a life was being lived, not just maintained. "Thank you," she said again, as she had said it before, but this time it was said differently. It had a fullness to it. She was looking at him and he was looking at her, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of the morning and the flowers, and Jonas Ramsey, who was not generally a man who did things without thinking them through first, stepped forward and kissed her. It was not a long kiss. It was the kind of first kiss that is mostly about declaration, about making something that has been building for months into something real and actual. She did not step back. She put her free hand flat against his chest, not pushing him away but making contact, and when it ended, she kept her eyes closed for a moment in a way that told him something important. When she opened her eyes, she looked at him with the steady gaze he had come to know so well, and she said simply, "It took you long enough." He laughed, which surprised him. "You could have said something sooner," he pointed out. "I was waiting to see if you would be the one to say it," she said, and she set the flowers down on the table and straightened her apron. "Sit down. I'm going to make breakfast and you are going to tell me what you actually want going forward, not in a vague way, specifically." He sat down. She put a pan on the stove. The flowers stood in their jar between them. He told her specifically. He told her that he wanted to keep working the double cross through the summer while he continued saving money, and that by the fall he thought he would have enough to buy in on some land. He told her he had been looking at a parcel that adjoined hers to the north, not because it would combine with her property in any official sense unless she wanted it to, but because it would put him close to where he wanted to be. He told her that he was not asking her to make any decisions or promises today, but that he wanted her to know the direction of his intentions. She listened to all of this, turning the eggs in the pan, her back mostly to him, and then she turned around and brought the plates to the table and sat down across from him and said, "My father wrote to me last month. He is not well. He is in California and he is not young, and I have been thinking about whether I should go to him." Jonas absorbed this. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "I want him to be all right," she said. "Whether I should make the journey is a different question. This land does not run itself. "I could look after it," Jonas said, "if you needed to go. Cletus cannot manage alone, but I could come in the mornings before the double-cross work and Cletus could keep the routines. The wheat will be harvested before you would need to leave." She looked at him across the table. "You would do that?" "Of course I would," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Jonas," she said, "what do you actually want from me, from all of this?" He met her gaze. "I want to marry you," he said. "When you are ready and not before then. I am not asking right now. I am telling you the direction I am pointed in." She looked at her plate, and he could see the contained fullness in her expression again, that interior brightness she kept so carefully. Then she looked back up. "I am pointed in the same direction," she said, "for what it is worth." "It is worth a great deal," he said. Breakfast tasted exceptionally good that morning. The summer moved forward in its hot, busy way. Jonas continued his work at the Double Cross, which under Del Whitmore's management was an efficiently run and honest outfit, and the work there was demanding enough to keep any man fully occupied on weekdays. But his Sundays at the Yates homestead had taken on a new quality, at once more comfortable and more charged, the ease of people who have admitted something important to each other, and are now living in the new territory that admission has created. He came by on weekday evenings when he could, which was not often, but when he did, they would sometimes sit on the front steps as the sun went down and talk about everything and nothing, and sometimes she would read to him from the novels she borrowed from a lending library that a schoolteacher in Caldwell maintained informally, and her reading voice was steady and expressive, and he could have listened to it for a very long time. One evening in late July, Del Whitmore came to find Jonas at the fence line where he was working and told him that a cattle drive was coming through the region in 3 days and that the Double Cross had agreed to provide 2 hands to help move part of the herd north for a week. Jonas was one of the designated men. Whitmore was straightforward about it, reasonable, and Jonas had no grounds to object and would not have dreamed of objecting since it was part of his employment. He told Whitmore yes, and rode to the Yates homestead that evening to tell Eudora he would be gone for the better part of a week. She received the news with the practical equanimity that was her characteristic response to inconveniences. "Of course," she said, "it is your work." Then she paused and added, "I will miss you, just so you know." "I will miss you considerably more," he said. She looked at him sideways and said, "I doubt that." He was gone 8 days. The drive went north without serious incident. One steer lame and recovered. One storm that came sideways and kept everyone soaked for a day and a half. And at night when he was rolled in his bedding beside the small fire, looking up at the Kansas stars, he thought about a particular kitchen table with a jar of flowers on it and the woman who sat across it from him, and he thought the week felt very long indeed. When he returned, he rode directly to the homestead rather than back to the bunkhouse, and she came out the door when she heard Copper's hooves in the yard, and she stood on the porch looking at him with the brightness she did not always show. And he swung down from the saddle and was barely on the ground before she had stepped off the porch and met him halfway across the yard, and he put his arms around her, and she put hers around him, and they stood like that for a moment in the late afternoon sun while the dogs from the barn came over to investigate the commotion. 8 days is too long, he said into her hair. 7 would also have been too long, she said. But yes. He took his hat off and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a moment and then kissed her, and this time it was not merely declarative. She looked up at him afterward and said, "You smell like a cattle drive." "I absolutely do," he confirmed. She laughed and took his hand and brought him inside and fed him the best meal he had eaten in over a week. August arrived with its weight of heat, and the Double Cross was deep in the final push before the harvest season demanded its own calendar of labor. Jonas worked long hours and valued the Sundays more than he could easily have expressed, and the garden along the south wall of the Yates house had by August reached its full and glorious height, the hollyhocks touching the eaves, the whole stretch of ground along the house, a continuous wash of color that Jonas could see from the road as he turned his horse toward the property. He had also quietly done some inquiring about the northern parcel, the one that adjoined the Yates property. It belonged to a man named Perkins who was in Caldwell, but had been talking about returning to Ohio for over a year. Through one of the other ranch hands, Jonas learned that Perkins was now serious about leaving and had set a price on the land that was within reach of what Jonas had saved, or would be within reach by October. He went to see Perkins one Saturday in town, and they talked in the careful, sideways way that land transactions in those years began, each man feeling out the other's seriousness without committing too early. Perkins was a practical man with family pressures pulling him east, and Jonas was straightforward about his interest. They did not shake hands that day, but the negotiation had begun. He did not tell Eudora about the land purchase yet, not because he was hiding it from her, but because he wanted it to be a certain thing before he spoke of it. He had learned in the last several months that she placed great value on actions over declarations, and that showing her something done was more meaningful to her than promising it. He was not wrong about this. He knew it from the garden. He had not promised her flowers. He had planted them. He told her about the Perkins land on a Sunday afternoon in late August. Sitting in the garden, she had made so much a part of the property that it seemed like it had always been there, the hollyhocks rustling in a mild, warm wind above them. "Perkins is selling," he said. "The north parcel. I have been in negotiations." She looked at him with the knowing steadiness she always had. "I know you have," she said. "Perkins told his neighbor Hartley, and Hartley told Cletus. Caldwell is a small town." "Did you mind?" he asked. "No," she said. "I thought it was a good idea, and I thought you would tell me when you were ready." "I am telling you now," he said. "I think I will have enough by October. The land is good. It is 120 acres, and it shares my fence line on the south and your fence line on the north, which would make things practical." "Practical," she said, and the word had warmth in it. "Practical and also intentional," he said. She looked at the hollyhocks for a moment. "If we were to pool what we have," she said without looking at him, "between your savings and what I have put aside, the purchase would not stretch either of us as thin." He understood what she was saying. He did not take it lightly. "That would require a formal arrangement between us," he said. "It would," she agreed. "Eudora," he said. He had not prepared a speech, and he did not make one. "I would like you to be my wife. I have wanted to ask you properly for some time, and I am asking now." She turned her head and looked at him, and the smile on her face was unlike any version of it he had seen before. It was wide and certain and absolutely uncontained, and it changed her whole face into something radiant, and he thought that if he could see that expression directed at him for the rest of his life, he would have done something very right. "Yes," she said. "Jonas Ramsey. Yes." He reached into his shirt pocket, because he was not entirely unprepared, and produced a thin gold ring that had been his mother's, and that he had been carrying in his pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. He put it on her finger, and she looked at it for a long moment, and then looked back at him, and he kissed her in the garden among the hollyhocks, while the warm August wind moved through the blooms above them. They were married in Caldwell in September of 1882, on a Saturday with good weather, in the small Methodist church that had been built the previous year, and still smelled faintly of fresh lumber when the doors were opened. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend George Hawthorne, a soft-spoken man who had a gift for brevity and sincerity in equal measure. The witnesses were Del Whitmore, who wore his Sunday suit and looked both pleased and slightly uncomfortable, and Mrs. Patterson from the general store, who wore her best dress and wept from the moment the ceremony began in a way that she seemed to find perfectly acceptable. Eudora wore a dress of cream-colored cotton with small pearl buttons down the front that had been her mother's, altered to fit her by a woman in Caldwell who had nimble fingers and a good eye. Her hair was arranged beneath a small hat, and she carried a bouquet of flowers from her own garden, hollyhocks and black-eyed Susans, and a great many of the sweet William. And she walked down the aisle of that small church with them, held against her front in both hands and her chin level, and her eyes entirely clear, looking at Jonas where he stood waiting. and he thought in that moment that he understood exactly what the word fortunate meant in a way he had never understood it before. After the ceremony, such celebration as was practicable in a small Kansas town in 1882 was conducted at the Caldwell saloon, which Greer had made more respectable for the afternoon by covering the bar with a cloth and laying out food that his wife had made. The community gathered, because communities in small towns gather for weddings as a matter of civic importance, and there was music from a fiddle player named Macready who played reels with tremendous enthusiasm and variable accuracy. Jonas danced with his wife in the open space that had been cleared for the purpose, and she danced well, better than he did, which she pointed out with considerable amusement when he stepped on her foot. "You ride better than you dance," she said. "I have never claimed otherwise," he said, and she laughed, and they kept dancing. Cletus raised a cup of cider and made a toast that was 3 words long, about damn time, which was universally appreciated for its accuracy. They spent their first nights as husband and wife at the homestead, which was now their homestead, and the land transaction with Perkins was completed in October as planned, and Jonas Ramsey had himself a piece of Kansas soil that was legally his, and that adjoined his wife's property in exactly the practical and intentional way he had described. He kept working at the Double Cross through the fall, because the money was necessary, and because Del Whitmore was a fair employer, and because the Ramsey homestead, as it would need to be collectively thought of, was going to require investment before it could fully sustain itself. They discussed this practically and without significant disagreement, because both of them were people who had spent years making careful decisions with limited resources, and they both understood the geometry of the situation. Eudora's letter to her father had not gone unanswered. He wrote back in August, and his letter was shaky in its handwriting but warm in its content. He was ailing, he confirmed, but managing, and he had a neighbor woman who came in to help him. He said he was glad Eudora had found someone good and he hoped to meet Jonas when his health permitted. Eudora read this letter at the kitchen table with a careful face, and Jonas sat across from her and waited and then said, "We could go to California in the spring if you want to, after the wheat is planted." She looked up at him over the letter. "It would be a long journey." "Yes," he said. "Cletus could not manage alone," she said. "We would find someone to come in. It is 6 weeks, maybe 8. This is your father, Eudora." She set the letter down and looked at it for a moment and then said, "Yes, in the spring, after the planting." They went west in April of 1883, taking the train from Caldwell to Kansas City, and then the longer route to California, which in those years was still a considerable undertaking even with the railroad routes available. Jonas had arranged for a neighbor, a reliable young man named Pharaoh, to stay at the homestead with Cletus during their absence, and he and Eudora rode through landscapes neither of them had seen before, the mountains and the long valleys of the West, and they talked and played cards and read to each other from the books she had packed, and slept sitting up in their seat when the train moved through the night. Eudora's father, Thomas Yates, lived in a small town in the Sacramento Valley in a house that was modest and cluttered with evidence of a life that had moved through many phases. He was thinner than the photograph Eudora had shown Jonas, and he moved slowly, but his eyes were sharp and his mind was quick, and he received Jonas with the shrewd attentiveness of a father making a final determination about a man. Over 3 weeks of meals and long afternoons on the old man's porch, Jonas was examined thoroughly and without apology, which he respected. Thomas Yates asked him direct questions about his finances, his intentions, his religious convictions, and his opinions on various matters of agriculture and character, and Jonas answered everything honestly, including the finances, which he felt were the most sensitive and the most important to be straight about. On their last evening, when Eudora had gone inside to help Thomas's neighbor prepare supper, Thomas sat in his chair on the porch and looked at Jonas for a long moment and said, "She had a hard couple of years. After Daniel, I was too far away to be much use." "She managed well," Jonas said, better than most people would have. I know she did, Thomas said. I also know the cost of that. Managing alone takes something out of a person. He paused. She looks different now. Better. Not just well, different. He looked at Jonas. You did that. She did it herself, Jonas said. I just planted a garden. Thomas looked at him with a complicated expression and said, Boy, a man who understands that what a woman needs sometimes is for someone to notice what she misses and then go and do something about it without being asked. That man is worth his weight in something considerably more valuable than gold. Jonas did not have an answer for that. He looked out at the California evening and felt the weight of the old man's words settle around him like something permanent. Thomas Yates passed away in November of that same year, 1883, quietly and in his sleep, in the house in California. The neighbor woman wrote to Eudora, and the letter arrived in Caldwell in December, and Eudora read it and folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket and went about the day's work. That evening Jonas found her sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the table in front of her, not crying exactly, but present with something heavy. He sat down across from her and did not say anything, and she looked at him after a while and said, He was glad to have seen us. I am grateful for that. He was a good man, Jonas said. He was, she said. He would have liked you. Well, he did like you. He told me so. She paused. He said you reminded him of himself when he was younger. Jonas felt the honor of that land firmly on him. That is the finest thing anyone has said to me in a long time, he said honestly. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they stayed like that in the kitchen for a good while, the lamplight warm around them, the jar of late-season flowers she had dried and kept on the table standing between them. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a time of building, in both the practical and interior senses. Jonas was by then working less frequently at the Double Cross, having negotiated a reduced and seasonal arrangement with Del Whitmore that allowed him to spend more time developing the Ramsey land. He and Cletus, who had found a second wind with Jonas around to carry the heavier loads, worked through the cold months repairing and improving the buildings on the property. The bunkhouse that Jonas had been occupying on the Double Cross was a memory. He came home each evening to a lit house and the smell of supper and the sound of Eudora's voice, and he thought sometimes that it was remarkable how a person could spend years moving across a landscape and not know what they were missing until they stopped moving. Eudora had taken to the flower garden with the enthusiasm of someone who had waited a long time for something they loved very much to return to them. In the fall she had done what the manual recommended, protecting the roots of the perennials through the winter, and she had dried bouquets that hung throughout the house, filling the rooms with the brittle, sweet, faded scent of summer. She had also, on her own initiative, written to a seed catalog company in St. Louis and ordered an additional selection for the following spring, which she presented to Jonas one evening by simply laying the order form in front of him with a slightly defiant look, as though she expected him to object. Peonies, he said, reading the list. They take 2 years to bloom, she said, but when they do. Then we should plant them this coming spring, he said, and went back to his reading. The look on her face was extremely satisfying. By the spring of 1884, the Ramsey operation had grown to the point where Jonas was running cattle on his own land as well as managing the wheat fields on Eudora's original acreage. They were not wealthy, not in any absolute sense, but they were solvent and growing, and the land was producing what land in good hands could produce. Cletus finally, gracefully, announced that he was going to go live with his son in Abilene, citing his knees as the deciding factor, and Jonas gave him a fair sum and a good horse for his years of service, and Eudora hugged him at the gate with a warmth that made the old man look away with watery eyes before he rode off down the road with his back straight and his slow dignity intact. They hired 2 younger men that spring, brothers named Tull and Harvey Crane, who were 18 and 22 respectively, and had come up from Oklahoma looking for steady work. Jonas interviewed them himself and found them earnest and capable, and he paid them fair wages and worked alongside them without the assumption of superiority that made some employers difficult, and they respected him for it. And in April of 1884, Eudora told Jonas one morning over breakfast, with a directness that was entirely characteristic of her, that she was expecting their first child. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at her. She was watching him with a level expression that contained, beneath its steadiness, a transparency of feeling that she allowed him to see completely. "When?" he said. "October," she said, "give or take." He stood up from the table and came around to her side, and she stood up to meet him, and he held her the way he had that afternoon in the yard when he had returned from the cattle drive. And she put her arms around him, and they stood in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the windows and the jar of spring flowers she had already cut from the garden, which was showing its first green growth of the new season, sitting on the table beside them. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I am wonderful," she said. "Are you?" "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said, which was simply true. Their son was born in October of 1884, on a cold, clear night with stars sharp and bright outside the bedroom window. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Holt, attended without drama, and Jonas stayed close throughout in the way that men of that period were not always expected to do, because Eudora had looked at him several weeks prior and said plainly that she would like him there, and he had agreed without a second's hesitation. The boy arrived at something past midnight with a strong voice and a thick head of dark hair that was, according to Mrs. Holt, as much hair as she had seen on a newborn in recent memory. They named him Thomas Daniel Ramsey, the first name for Eudora's father and the second for her late husband, who had been a decent man and deserved not to be forgotten, and Jonas had agreed to both without reservation because he understood that honoring the full life of the woman he loved was part of loving her. Thomas Daniel Ramsey was a large, vigorous, opinionated baby who developed quickly into a large, vigorous, opinionated small boy, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's steady physical composure, and who was deeply beloved by both his parents in the uncomplicated and entire way that first children are. Caldwell in the mid-1880s was a town in transition. The cattle drives that had made it a notable stop on the trail north were beginning to decline as the railroads expanded and routes shifted, and the great days of the open trail drives gave way to more regulated and settled patterns of commerce. This was in some ways a loss, and in some ways simply the world moving forward in its practical direction, and Jonas observed it without sentimentality, adapting the operation of his land accordingly. He had expanded the cattle herd on his acreage with care, and the fields were producing well. He had also, in the spring of 1885, extended the flower garden along the south wall of the house into a second section that wrapped around the eastern corner, adding the peonies that Eudora had ordered the previous year, which were now in their second season, and showing their first blooms, as she had predicted, in the most elaborate and extravagant way, great rose pink, flowers the size of a man's fist that she cut and put in every jar and container in the house. "I told you," she said, carrying an enormous bunch of them across the yard with the satisfaction of someone whose faith has been entirely vindicated. "You did tell me," he agreed. "You told me correctly." She handed him 3 of the blooms, because they were his flowers too, she always said that, and he put them in the front pocket of his shirt in a way that made Tull Crane, who was mending a fence nearby, look away with considerable effort to conceal his amusement. Jonas caught Tull's expression and gave him a look that was mild but clear, and Tull found an urgent reason to move to the other side of the fence. Young Thomas, who was 18 months old that spring and walking with the determined instability of a person who has recently discovered the technology of legs and is not yet fully in command of it, was deeply interested in the flower garden and required constant supervision near it. He did not damage anything intentionally, but his enthusiasm for investigation occasionally resulted in small casualties, and Eudora had developed a system of low fencing around the most vulnerable sections that was both functional and instructive. Jonas spent one Saturday morning sitting in the dirt beside his son, showing him with great patience how to identify a flower by its leaf. And Thomas sat in the dirt too, holding a black-eyed Susan stem with both fat hands and staring at it with an expression of such concentrated thought that Jonas felt something so enormous and warm in his chest that it almost alarmed him. He wrote to his own mother in Tennessee that spring, a letter he had been intending to write for months and kept putting aside. He told her about Eudora and about the homestead and the land and about Thomas Daniel, and he told her he was well and settled and working hard, and that he hoped she was well, and that he would like her to come and visit if she was ever able. His mother wrote back within the month, a long letter full of Tennessee news and theological commentary and genuine warmth, and she said she was glad he had found his place, and that she would pray for them all, and that she hoped Eudora knew what a good man she had. He showed the letter to Eudora, who read it carefully and then said, "I would like to write to her, if that would be all right." She would love that, Jonas said, which was true. His mother was a woman who valued correspondence with the same devotion she brought to everything else. The correspondence between Eudora Ramsey and Margaret Ramsey, who had never met, began that spring of 1885 and continued for many years thereafter, covering topics from child-rearing to gardening to the comparative merits of different approaches to preserving fruit, and eventually deepening into the kind of frank and warm exchange that exists between women who have recognized in each other a similar quality of character. In 1886, Eudora was expecting again. This time the pregnancy was harder, not dangerous, the midwife assured them, but wearying in a way the first had not been, and Jonas took on more of the household work through the winter months without comment or complaint, cooking what he was capable of cooking, which was limited but honest, and managing the endless small tasks of the property so that she could rest when she needed to. Their second child was a girl, born in March of 1886, with her father's reddish-brown coloring and a temperament that was, from the very first weeks, entirely distinctive and entirely her own. They named her Margaret Yates Ramsey, for Jonas's mother and Eudora's family name both, and called her Maggie from the start, and she was from the beginning a serious, watchful, occasionally formidable small person who would eventually grow up to be exactly the kind of woman who, when she wanted something, knew how to go about getting it. Thomas was not entirely sure about his new sister for the first few months, but eventually came around, as children do, to the fascination of having a person around who was smaller than himself. And by the time Maggie was old enough to crawl, she was already following her brother around with an expression of focused determination that suggested she had assessed the situation and decided he was the most interesting feature of the landscape. The homestead in 1886 and 1887 was a place of full and productive life. The cattle herd was growing. The wheat fields were consistent. The house had been extended by one room to accommodate the expanded family, a project that Jonas and Tull Crane completed over 2 weeks in the fall of 1886, and the addition gave them a room for the children and a slightly larger kitchen that made the whole house feel more like the thing Jonas had described once at the kitchen table, a place where things were in their right places. The flower garden had by this time grown to encompass the entire south-facing exposure of the house and half the eastern side, and Eudora had added a cutting section in the yard behind the kitchen, specifically for the flowers that were to be brought inside, so that the garden beds themselves could grow uninterrupted to their full visual effect, while the house was supplied with fresh arrangements from May through October. In the winter, dried bouquets from the summer's abundance decorated every room, and Eudora had begun teaching Thomas, who was now old enough to be interested, the names of the various plants and the principles of how they grew. Jonas came home one October evening in 1887 to find Thomas, who was 3 years old, standing in the garden beside his mother with a very small trowel, pressing a tulip bulb into a hole he had dug with tremendous and imprecise effort, his tongue between his teeth and his expression one of absolute concentration. "He asked to plant one," Eudora said, looking up at Jonas over their son's absorbed head. "He said he wanted to do what Papa does." Jonas crouched down beside Thomas and looked at the tulip bulb in the hole. "Good depth," he said. "You want it about twice as deep as the bulb is tall." Thomas looked at the hole. "Is it too shallow?" "Maybe a little," Jonas said. "Want to go a bit deeper?" Thomas retrieved the bulb, dug industriously for another 30 seconds, replanted the bulb and looked up at his father with an expression of achievement that Jonas felt in the most tender part of himself. "Good?" Thomas asked. "Perfect," Jonas said. Eudora met Jonas's eyes over their son's head, and what passed between them in that look was the kind of wordless communication that accumulates between two people who have been truly present in each other's lives for years, the full specific weight of gratitude and love, and the recognition of something that has been built together, stone by stone and season by season, into something real and lasting. The years that followed had their difficulties, because no life in any era is without them. The winter of 1888 was brutal, one of the worst the Kansas Territory had seen in years, and livestock losses across the region were significant. The Ramsey operation survived better than many, partly because Jonas had prepared well and partly because he made the kind of decisive choices in a crisis that come from having spent years learning to read what the land and the animals needed. They lost several head of cattle and one of the horses, and there were weeks when the cold was so extreme that the children were kept close to the stove and everyone wore multiple layers indoors. But they came through it with the core of the operation intact. Tull Crane, who had been with them 3 years by then, proved himself indispensable in that winter, working alongside Jonas through conditions that would have sent a lesser man inside. And Jonas gave him a raise that spring that he had been planning for some time, and that Tull received with the particular dignity of a young man who has been recognized fairly. Harvey Crane had left the previous year to start his own venture further west, with Jonas's blessing and a good reference, and Tull remained, having evidently decided that he had found where he belonged. Eudora's sister Clara came to visit in the summer of 1888, arriving from Missouri with her own husband and 2 children in a visit that lasted 3 weeks and filled the house with noise and life, and the particular warm chaos that extended families produce. Clara and Eudora had not seen each other in nearly 4 years, and the reunion had the quality of 2 people who had each grown considerably since their last meeting, discovering that they had grown in complementary rather than divergent directions. Clara's husband, a steady, quiet man named Obadiah Marsh, sat on the porch with Jonas in the evenings after supper, and they talked about farming and weather, and the state of the railroad prices with the comfortable efficiency of 2 men who have nothing to prove to each other. He was a good man, Jonas assessed, and Eudora's sister was clearly happy, which mattered considerably. The children, Thomas and Maggie and Clara's 2, a boy of 4 and a girl of 6, established a domestic republic of their own in the yard and in the hayloft of the barn, governed by rules that were invented as needed and enforced with varying consistency. And the adults let them manage it because children left largely to their own devices in a safe environment will generally produce something instructive. The night before Clara and her family left, the 2 sisters sat on the porch together after the children were in bed and the men had retired, and Jonas, passing through the kitchen on his way to check the pump, heard through the open window enough of their conversation to understand that Clara had said something that made Eudora cry, which was rare enough that it stopped him. He went quietly out the back way and left them to it. He understood that there were kinds of love and closeness that had their own complete territory, and that being a good husband did not mean occupying all of his wife's interior landscape. He sat on the back step in the warm summer night and looked at the garden, the dark shapes of the hollyhocks and the tall coneflowers standing pale in the starlight, and thought about the distance he had traveled, not just in miles, from a bunkhouse in Texas to this property in Kansas, but in terms of what he was now and what he had been, what he understood now that he had not known to look for then. He heard the screen door open and Eudora came around the side of the house and sat down beside him on the step. She did not say anything for a moment. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side. "Clara says we are lucky," she said. "We are," he said. "She also said something that made me realize," Eudora said and paused. "I was in a very small dark place for a while after Daniel died. Not in a way that I spoke about to anyone, but I was. I had decided, I think, without quite knowing it, that the best I could do was manage. That managing was what was available to me." He was quiet, listening. "And then a man I had never met caught a crate of dry goods outside Patterson's store," she said. "And then he came back every Sunday. And then one spring morning he arrived with a spade and a bag of seeds and a battered manual about how to grow flowers." She paused. "And I understood, I think, that managing was not all that was available to me." He thought about what her father had said on the porch in California about noticing what a woman misses and doing something about it, and he said, "You would have found your way. You had already found most of it." She turned her head and looked at him in the dark. "You made it easier to believe in," she said simply. He held her a little closer. The garden rustled in the soft night wind around them. Somewhere from the direction of town, a dog barked once and went quiet. "I love you," he said, which he said to her often but always with the same undiminished sincerity. "I love you," she said, "and I still have fresh flowers on my kitchen table, which is more than I dared to hope for." He laughed softly, and she did too, and they sat together on the step for a while longer in the warm Kansas summer night. In the spring of 1889, when Kansas was adjusting to the realities of its full statehood era, and the land around them was settled by people who had come to make permanent lives rather than passing ones, Eudora told Jonas she was expecting again. This one came in October, as Thomas had, a boy with Jonas's coloring and his mother's directness, who they named Henry Yates Ramsey, the middle name another deliberate carrying forward of what had come before. 3 children made the house full in a way that was both exhausting and irreplaceable, and Jonas navigated fatherhood with the same quality of attention he brought to everything else he valued, which was a thorough and present and unglamorous kind of dedication. He fixed things when they broke, taught his children things he knew, listened to them with genuine interest when they talked, and maintained a consistent, principled kindness in his conduct toward them, and toward their mother that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives and recognize, when they were old enough to think about it, as the rarest and most important thing they had been given. Cletus, who had been in Abilene with his son for 6 years, passed away in 1889, and the letter from his son came to the homestead, because Cletus had apparently kept the Ramsey address and requested it. They marked his passing with genuine sadness, and Eudora said prayers for him that evening at the table, which the children sat through with the particular solemn attention that small people give to the incomprehensible gravity in adult voices. The Double Cross Ranch was sold in 1890, Del Whitmore having decided to retire to Colorado to be near his daughter's family, and Jonas rode out to say goodbye to his former employer on the day Whitmore loaded his wagon. They shook hands for a long time, and Whitmore told him he was the best hand he had ever employed, and Jonas told him he was the fairest employer he had ever worked for, and both men meant it completely. And then Whitmore drove his wagon down the road, and Jonas watched him go with a feeling of time's passage that was not sad exactly, but had weight. The Ramsey operation was by then self-sufficient. They had cattle, wheat, and a diversifying approach that included hogs and chickens, and a growing kitchen garden enterprise that Eudora had developed into something that supplied not only their own household, but, in good seasons, produced a surplus sold at the Caldwell market. She had also, over the years, developed a small business in dried flower arrangements and medicinal herb preparations that had a loyal following among the women of the region, sold through Mrs. Patterson's store, which had passed to the old woman's daughter-in-law but still operated from the same building on the same main street. Tull Crane, now 26 and entirely capable, had effectively become the Ramsey operation's second-in-command, and he had also, in the spring of 1891, married a quiet and industrious young woman from a farm south of town named Bess Hawthorne, the Reverend Hawthorne's niece, and they were building their own small house on the western edge of the Ramsey land, a corner of it that Jonas had proposed they use, an arrangement that benefited everyone and that had been Jonas's idea entirely. Offered without strings, from the simple logic that a good man should have a place to build something of his own. Thomas Ramsey, at 6 years old, was by 1890 a boy of considerable energy and particular interests, one of which was the garden. He had graduated from the small trowel to real tools, and he worked alongside his mother with a seriousness that she rewarded with real instruction, teaching him not just which seeds went where but why, the principles behind it, what the plants needed and why they needed it, and what happened when you understood those needs and responded to them. He listened in a way that made Eudora sometimes look at Jonas over his head with an expression of quiet, amazed gratitude, as though she were watching something she had put in the ground come up in a form more beautiful than she had dared to expect. Maggie, at 5, had less interest in the garden than in the cattle, which she observed from the fence with the focused, evaluative expression of someone who was gathering information for future use. Jonas had caught her more than once attempting to communicate with the horses in a language she had apparently developed for this purpose, and he had quietly encouraged this rather than discouraging it, because he recognized a particular quality of attention in her that was worth cultivating. Henry, at 1 year old, had opinions about everything and the vocal capacity to express all of them, which he did at volume and with consistency, and which his siblings tolerated with the resigned adaptation of people who have grown accustomed to a natural phenomenon that is outside their control. The spring of 1892 found the Ramsey homestead at the height of its first decade of existence as such, a working, growing, inhabited place that bore little resemblance to the modest and somewhat struggling property that Jonas had first ridden past in the spring of 1882, catching a glimpse of a woman with a sprig of dried lavender pressed to her nose and a crate of dry goods balanced on her hip. The garden had by 1892 expanded to take up the full south and east sides of the house and a substantial portion of the yard, and Eudora had organized it into a formal series of beds separated by narrow gravel paths that she and Thomas had laid together over 2 seasons, so that one could walk through the garden rather than simply look at it. The hollyhocks were still there, still the tallest and most dramatic element, reaching nearly to the roofline in the full summer, in the same pink and white and deep red that had first bloomed in the summer of 1882. The peonies were magnificent in their maturity, broad and established, throwing their enormous blooms in late spring with the extravagance of something that knew its value. The black-eyed Susans had naturalized into a kind of informal meadow in the lower corner of the garden, which had been allowed to go semi-wild because Eudora said that some flowers had more beauty when they were not kept too tightly, which Jonas had thought was also true of people and had said so, and she had looked at him with that expression that combined amusement and warmth in the particular ratio that he had been cataloging in his memory for 10 years. On a morning in late May of 1892, Jonas was in the garden with a watering can. It was early, before the children were up, and the light was the particular pale gold of Kansas mornings in the late spring, and the garden was very quiet and full of the smell of damp earth and the complex sweetness of multiple blooming things. He was moving along the path between the peonies and the hollyhocks when he heard the back door of the house open, and Eudora came out with 2 cups of coffee, as she did sometimes on these quiet mornings, and she walked along the gravel path to where he was standing and handed him a cup. They stood together in the garden, not talking, drinking their coffee in the morning light. The hollyhocks were just beginning to open their first blooms of the season, tight still at the top, and opening in loose pink rosettes further down the stems. The sweet william was showing its dense clusters of small flowers at knee-height along the path, filling the lower air with its particular fragrance, the same fragrance that had been so entirely absent from the south wall of this house 10 years ago. "I was thinking," Eudora said, "about something Thomas asked me yesterday." "What did he ask?" Jonas said. "He asked me why we grow flowers when they are not food," she said. "He is practical like his father," Jonas smiled. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that they are food," she said. "That the part of a person that needs beauty is just as real as the part that needs bread, and that if you ignore it long enough it gets very hungry and that affects everything else." She paused. "He thought about that and then he asked if he could plant more sweet williams in the new bed by the fence." Jonas laughed. "What did you say?" "I said yes," she said. "Obviously." He looked at her profile in the morning light, the line of her face that he had looked at for 10 years and still found endlessly worthy of attention. She was 36 years old and she wore her years in the way of women who have lived honestly in them, the lines around her eyes from sun and from laughter, and from the occasional sustained worry of a life being responsibly managed, the dark hair with its first threads of silver that she made no effort to conceal and that he found, if anything, more beautiful than it had been at 26. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" he said. She looked at him. "Tell me." "I think about riding into Caldwell in the spring of '82, he said, "not knowing anything. Not knowing that in 20 minutes I was going to see a woman standing outside Patterson's store holding a piece of dried lavender. Not knowing that in 3 years I would be standing in her garden." He looked at the beds around them. "Your garden." "Our garden," she said, with the same gentle correction she always made. "Our garden," he agreed. "I did not know what I was going to have. I rode into that town to get my horse shod and find work. And instead," she said. "And instead," he said, "I found everything." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she did sometimes, simply resting there in the uncomplicated closeness of people who have been each other's daily company for years, and find in it a comfort that needs no explanation or elaboration. The garden moved lightly in the early morning air around them. Inside the house, they could hear the particular sound of small feet on a wooden floor, the household waking up to another day of its full and particular life. "The peonies are going to be spectacular this year," she said. "They always are," he said. "I want to try dahlias," she said. "I read about them in the new catalog. They bloom late in the season into October." "Then we should plant them," he said. "Show me where you want them and we will dig the beds." She lifted her head and looked at him. "You say we." "I always say we," he said. "You do," she agreed, and looked back at the garden with her private interior brightness showing in her expression, the one that had always undone him. "When we planted the first seeds," she said, "when you came with that spade and that battered manual, I remember thinking, this man has never done anything like this before. He is doing it anyway, because I said without meaning it as a request that I missed fresh flowers." "You said it was a small thing," he reminded her. "I did," she said. "I was wrong." "No," he said. "You were right that it was small. That is not the same as unimportant." He paused. "The small things are the ones that tell you what a person actually is." She looked up at him and her eyes were very clear. "I know what you are," she said softly. "Good," he said. "I know what you are too." She reached up and touched his jaw, briefly, with the back of her fingers, the simple physical language of a long and genuine love. And then she took his hand and turned back toward the house because the children were awake, and the morning was beginning and there were, as always, 10,000 things to do. He went with her, still holding her hand, through the garden with its fragrance and its color, past the hollyhocks that were opening their first blooms of the season, past the sweet william and the peonies and the black-eyed Susans and all the rest, all the particular abundant growing evidence of a single moment. A woman standing with dried lavender pressed to her nose. A man with a spade and a manual and the willingness to learn something new. A patch of turned earth beside a Kansas house. And everything. Everything that had grown from it. Thomas was at the kitchen table with a piece of bread and a serious expression when they came in, and Maggie was somewhere near the barn, already in conversation with the horses, and Henry was announcing something incomprehensible but urgent from the direction of his room. The kitchen smelled of the wood smoke from the stove that Eudora had banked the night before, and the morning light came through the windows in long, warm bars, and on the table, in the old canning jar that had held flowers every blooming season for 10 years, stood a single early peony, deep pink and enormous, filling the kitchen with its extravagant sweetness. Jonas Ramsey, who had ridden into a Kansas town one spring morning with nothing particular to his name except a steady horse and a willingness to work, looked at the flower on the table and at the woman who had put it there, and at the children arriving one by one into the bright kitchen of the morning, and he understood, with the complete clarity of a man who has lived long enough inside a good life to know it for what it is, that he had planted more than flowers. He had planted all of it. Not the garden only, though the garden was real and blooming and more beautiful each year, but all the patient, deliberate, generous living of it, the showing up, the noticing, the learning what he did not know in order to give what was needed, the choosing, season after season and year after year, to be the kind of man who did not wait to be asked before he reached for the spade. Eudora set her coffee cup on the table and turned to see what Henry needed and called to Thomas to eat his bread before it went cold and looked back at Jonas once with that clear, bright, private look that had been theirs alone for 10 years. And Jonas hung his hat on its peg by the door, exactly where it belonged, and went to help with breakfast. Outside, the garden grew in the morning sun, abundant and alive and rooted deep in the Kansas soil. And it would bloom again this season as it had every season, because that is what you plant when you believe in the future. And Jonas Ramsey had believed in the future since the morning he caught a falling crate outside a general store and met the woman who taught him what believing in it was actually worth.